What are they booing about? I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, we're very pleased today to have a special guest, Justin Lama Karma Wall, is joining us from New York. Hello, Justin.
Hello, Ron. Thanks for having me.
And
Hi, Justin.
My cohort, David, in Brooklyn. You're in Brooklyn today, aren't you, David?
Yes, I am. Down the hill in Park Slope. That's good to have you, Justin.
So we're going to start out by trying to learn a little bit about you, Justin, in terms of your early journey in terms of how you became a Tibetan Lama. So maybe you can start with, just sharing a little bit about what you were doing and how you kind of stumbled into this path.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So, as we were talking before, I think a lot of times when people are asked how they began, it generally begins with a lot of suffering. A lot of mental, emotional anguish that sort of draws one to a path. And for me, it was no different. I was in college and really looking for something to sign on to, something that I could stand behind. Or even a person that I actually believed in. And as is the case, I think, for a lot of people in colleges, universities, we really can't trust, a lot of our teachers on a deep level, maybe as experts in their field, but someone that you can really, tie your mind to in that way and appreciate beyond the norm, I think, is really rare. And it was just a very difficult time for me. And so my solution was just to read and to study, and through a lot of work came to Madhyamaka philosophy, and also came to develop a relationship with Bob Thurman, and that was profoundly liberating for me, just to be able to study and start to practice something that embraced relativity and embraced the type of illusory nature of the experiences that I was having. So that led me to seek a teacher and an intensive retreat experience. And I went to India and Nepal for the next year and came back to New York again and then dove into a 3-year retreat. And that was upstate New York at Kajju Thupten Choling.
And that's a traditional, the 3-year retreat in some of the Tibetan schools and traditions is fairly standard, isn't it? For practitioners that are. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, standard curriculum and very much transposed the Tibetan both language and approach and culture into upstate New York. So it was very much an experience of being an anthropologist as much as a practitioner. You have to do a lot of work to make things make sense or to really understand what's going on. So it's definitely not for everyone, but it did give me a very in-depth training in both the Tibetan approach and also the very powerful and beneficial methods that they've been able to preserve.
So you graduated from Columbia, and from there you went to India and came back, and then did a 3-year retreat in upstate New York at the Karma Kagyu Center there.
Correct, yeah, under Lama Nurla Rinpoche, and then I came out and felt a bit like half-baked bread, and so went in again for another 3 years, and that time I was in the role of a caretaker, but I was also doing my own retreat, and this time in the Nyingma lineage, and then after that, when I graduated, I went down to the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee to start a retreat center and build a stupa and live that life for a while.
Right. And your name of your retreat center in Tennessee is the Milarepa
Milarepa Retreat Center, yeah.
And Smoky Mountains.
We do in the Smoky Mountains, yep.
Must be beautiful. It's been a long time since I've been through the Smoky Mountains, but I remember driving and sleeping overnight somewhere at a national park there. Beautiful.
Yeah.
And what was the impetus to build that retreat center? I mean, that's quite an undertaking. You're fairly, compared to us old guys, you're fairly young. That's quite ambitious.
It was again just feeling like I wasn't finished yet. I wasn't able to, I don't know, just follow the normal track, and I felt like I had to continue to practice, but the 3-year retreat environment wasn't what was fitting anymore. I needed something to be much more hands-on and much more relational, both in terms of intimate relationship and also in terms of community relationship, and also just using my hands and connecting with the earth and actually building something rather than practicing in a meditation box. So it was very much motivated by a deep wish to continue to practice.
Right, and you mentioned needing to reconnect with the earth, and I think that's one of the key themes we're going to explore today. But could you say a little bit about you built a stupa at the
we are. We're continuing to build a stupa, and we're about halfway done now. And that's I went there with that in mind. That was kind of the focal point of everything. But then I quickly realized that in order to build a stupa, you have to build a community, and in order to build a community, you have to teach and build other aspects of infrastructure and gardens and all sorts of things. It's a pretty all-encompassing project.
Yeah.
When you consider a stupa, it's actually many things.
Right. So it's just not that particular object that we're familiar with, the shape and form. There's much more integrated, and it's an earth healing stupa. I mean, this is a very distinct intention you had.
Sure, yeah, and it's really to connect with the particular history of that region, in one way to establish Dharma in a borderland, as the tradition has it. You build a stupa, and that's kind of an anchor and a focal point. But I think on a larger level, it's really a gift to the earth. It's a gift to a particular region that can really restore and balance aspects that have been desecrated or abused, and it's really an expression of an intention, an altruistic intention to really give back to the earth and to honor the sacredness that is there.
Yes, that's quite inspiring.
Were you able to link up with local people or local community groups?
Indigenous groups, you mean?
Just people that lived in that part of Tennessee.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, we have a really strong community there, which is pretty unique. A number of different Buddhist groups, but yeah, we have a good Sangha, for sure.
Well, I think that's a great lead-in to your chapter, actually, for... I'm one of the editors for this the Handbook of Ethical Foundations of Mindfulness, which will be coming out later this year, a Springer series on mindfulness and behavioral health. But the chapter you wrote was just, to me, quite profound. It's called Sacred Groundlessness, Deepening the Ethics of Mindfulness in the Midst of the Global Crisis. And it's a very inspiring paper, and it's very deep. And I don't know if we could do it full justice, but we're going to try to tease out some of the ideas and themes that you have here. And I think one of the interesting reasons I think we wanted to interview you as well is because you're steeped both in the tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, Tibetan Kagyu tradition, and Nyingma, but at the same time, you have also been actively a mindfulness teacher in secular mindfulness settings. So in a way, you're kind of spanning both worlds. But at the same time, I think you are unique in being able to see some of the blind spots and some of the, well, maybe not blind spots, but at least the trajectory of mindfulness as we see it today in the West has been primarily an offshoot of the Theravada reform movement, which was picked up by Cornfield and Goldstein and the others, and turned it into insight meditation, and which now has morphed again into various forms of secular mindfulness interventions. So I think what's different, and what really comes through in this paper, is we really haven't seen the import, the full import, or even a sliver of the Tibetan tradition, and how that might be a whole different context, a whole different inflection in terms of how we interpret what mindfulness means in our society. And I think you're going to make an amazing contribution over the years. I just have this intuition. So could you say a little bit about, maybe before we jump into the paper, do you feel a bit schizophrenic in terms of being in both worlds?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a character trait. I think I have an oppositional defiant streak. I don't.
You won't use the word disorder.
Disorder, yeah.
It's a streak. That's good.
Order and disorder. And I remember being in retreat, especially the second time around, and by the end of it, really coming to this place of a deep criticism of the tradition, and basically understanding that mindfulness has its blind spots, and the tradition does as well. And I think I've always been in this middle place of the way that Thomas Merton puts it, living a life of obedience and rebellion, simultaneously. So when I was then continuing on in a traditional role, really seeing the limitations of that, and what brought me to mindfulness was very practical necessities of being able to make money, which that initiates a whole cascade of trouble, which we're bearing witness to in the mindfulness world. But at the same time, living a monastic life while trying to be in a relationship and support a family and so forth, it's not, they're not compatible fully. So I'm always in this, schizophrenic, I don't know, rock in a hard place situation perennially.
Or creative tension,
Or creative tension, sure. But that's where I'm always at anyway. So, and so in the world of mindfulness now, I think it is really, really interesting to see the advent of Tibetan contributions, and how we can make that bridge as well. So yeah.
All right. Well, maybe we'll talk a bit about what inspired you to write this chapter, the sacred groundlessness, and maybe can you just give maybe a bird's eye view of what we're trying to do in this chapter, and then we can drill down as we go further.
Sure. Yeah, I think the starting point, I imagine the starting point for the volume in general was just a recognition that as mindfulness is developing, the ethical component, when it's not integrated, results in some pretty pathological situations, which are a disservice to the source traditions as well as anybody practicing, in the modern context. So, so what do we do about ethics? And that's an important question. But then, when I was asked to write something on that topic, I really couldn't stop with just a surface consideration of, how do we navigate this question? To me, it had to go much deeper, and at a certain point, it felt that, and very much inspired by David Loy's work, it felt that if mindfulness can't sometimes answer the fundamental question of how do we act in the face of what I termed a crisis, a global crisis, which is environmental, social, etc. How do we step up to this very dire situation that we're in, however we define that situation? Then mindfulness isn't really what we need right now. We're at risk, and it's a serious risk. And so, for me, that was the key question to address. And of course, then it became a really sprawling consideration. But that was the seed.
Right, and you have a wonderful quote in the very first page of the chapter, I think, that kind of resonates throughout the rest of the chapter, and it's the quote by Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Do you want me to read that real quick?
Sure, yeah.
The quote is, "The bad news is you're falling through the air, nothing to hang on to, no parachute. The good news is there's no ground." And to me, that is the underlying theme of this whole paper. So what's happening here in terms of the way that mindfulness has avoided or this is a very, very difficult area for, like, I think you bring it up in the paper, that there are probably very good reasons why the mindfulness community and mindfulness discourse has stayed away pretty much from the insight aspect, the wisdom side, working with insight into emptiness and the illusory phenomena of all phenomena. What do you see happening there, Justin? What do you see in terms of how mindfulness could be taken deeper?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, first of all, I think there's the reasons. There's a few different reasons why mindfulness hasn't yet gone into those deeper waters, and I think one is just it's so new, and you have to start somewhere. You have to use the traditional analogy. You can't give solid food to a baby. You have to have something that's already pretty well digested, and for our culture to accommodate any kind of teachings on mind, it has to have already been digested, and meaning it has to be acceptable, it has to be palatable to the predispositions of our culture, and we have to understand that a discourse of mind is a very new thing, and that even in terms of science, psychology is something that was developed in the last 100 or so years. It was taboo before that, and to mention consciousness was equally taboo. Even as little as 30-40 years ago, you couldn't ask those questions, and so our culture in general can't really accommodate or hasn't been able to accommodate that. But I think that it's changing, and I think that that maturity is definitely shifting, and that we are ready to go deeper. And so, but beyond that, there are also, when you ask deeper questions, especially with respect to mortality or the illusory nature of phenomena and reality and so forth, it very much challenges a lot of the materialist presuppositions of our culture and all of the forces that are behind that, whether they're economic or political and so forth. So there's a lot of weight, that has to be cut through or overcome before something like mindfulness can venture into those areas.
Right, and the current mindfulness discourse has been situated primarily within the empirical scientific biomedical paradigm, and now with the the interest in contemplative neuroscience. Again, I think what we hear more of is about the brain, and the brain has become almost a privileged object, inherent of some sort of inherent existence, that consciousness is basically an epiphenomena of the brain, and the materialist one. So I could see how difficult these barriers to entry are in terms of going deeper with a different form of mindfulness that touches into the deeper waters, as you say. So we have the scientific, empirical, scientific materialism as on the one hand. Then we also have our Protestant, Western Protestant cultural tendency to try to strip away anything that appears non-scientific or non-Western. So that's another barrier there, and then of course, as mindfulness is situated within a Western consumerist culture, we have that barrier. You mentioned these actually in a different paper that you wrote called "The Original Oops: Mahamudra and the Mindfulness Movement."
And there also the aspect of facilitators who are qualified. In other words, you need, if you're going to open that door, you have to be prepared, and it's not something to take lightly that someone who is a beginner practitioner of meditation, mindfulness, whatever, steps into that space. It's really important that they either have someone there to guide them, or they have the benefit of a tradition or a context that can make sense of whatever experience they're having, so that it doesn't go off the rails. And so that's another lack in the mindfulness world in general, is just a lack of qualification of facilitators.
Yeah, and I mean that's happening even with 8-week MBSR programs. I mean, there's even people who are just doing some fairly preliminary calm abiding. Even they can destabilize, and as we've seen in some of the work that Willoughby Britton has done recently and her colleagues. So let's turn our attention into how can we understand the situation we're in? You're characterizing it as nihilistic. We're dealing with nihilism, and we're in denial in many ways that we are a dying planet. And that really struck me because right before I read your paper, I had just finished a few months earlier, I think I mentioned it to you on email, this book called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, which was a remarkable book. I can't remember the author's name now. But your paper kind of reminded me of the role of philosophy as an intervention, cultural intervention, because this really is a deeply philosophical problem in terms of the sense of duality that we live in, this dualistic world that causes so much suffering. So I'm wondering if you can give us a few highlights of your thinking in terms of how by going into a different mode of awareness that this can actually be a new path for not just individuals but for our culture. I know it's a big question.
Right. Yeah, no, like there's a lot of dimensions to it, and I really when I started doing the research for the paper, it was actually I had three discrete parts, and those three parts were related to what I saw as emerging trends in mindfulness, and I was actually only able to write on the first part, and that's what we have here. But just in general, there was this the entry of compassion and this aspect of insight into mindfulness, which we've been talking about already. The aspect of groundlessness, of illusion, of virtual reality, however you want to approach it. And then there's also, which I thought was a crisis of being, a crisis of nihilism, a crisis of not being able to authentically approach mortality. And the fact that there is no more ground, and I think we can talk mainly about that. But just to mention the other aspects, I think that there's also a crisis of sacredness that we have lost. The experience and view of our lives and our environment as being sacred, and that I saw being addressed by adaptations of Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions into secular formats, where the basic goodness that we can contact is actually the ground for appreciation of sacredness, and obviously that would have huge ramifications in terms of ecology and so forth. And then the third is the aspects of relational woundedness, of aspects of ourselves that have been hurt, that are unable to love or be loved, and so forth. And that I saw being addressed by movements in mindfulness of relational practices, relational mindfulness. And so all three of these can be brought to bear on the crisis in different ways. And I think it's important to say that the darker side that I emphasized in that paper is just one of those facets. There's also this aspect of the sacred, and there's also this aspect of relationality. But so just to focus on that first part of how do we deny death, and how do we live in resistance to that free fall that we're in, that this lack of ground, that manifests in so many different ways that our culture is already either in awareness of or in denial of. We have many trends in film and in literature that are reminding us that our life is like a dream, or that we may be living in a computer simulation, or different ways of opening up the context of what we believe reality to be. So it's already on the table. It's in people's collective awareness already, but the experience of that is something that most people can't admit. It's too challenging, too anxiety-provoking, or the denial of that creates varieties of depression and shutdown and so forth. And so what I was seeing, or what I was envisioning, is that the insight traditions, where you actually learn to become accustomed to groundlessness, become able to fly in this state of free fall, would be a huge medicine for people who are in that place of either denial or anxiety about the fact of groundlessness itself, and then being able to turn that familiarity, that ability to speak about experiences, that ability to train and to give someone some sort of for lack of a better word, something to hold on to, something to do in that space. That could be a huge force for empowering people and empowering communities of like-minded people to overcome fear and overcome resistance, and actually unlock the resources needed to affect the kind of social, communal changes we need to address the global crisis.
Yeah, I find it interesting too how, we are in the process of cultural translation ongoing for Buddhism in the West, and I like how you, in a way, are framing liberation not as a metaphysical goal, but more as a liberation in terms of sustainable responses to the global crisis that we're in.
Right.
And
right.
that to me touches on another part of your paper, which goes into uncontrived compassion, which is an expression of the embodiment of emptiness. And I think that's a whole new discourse, too, for the mindfulness community, because we hear a lot right now about the therapeutic aspects of, I think they call it self-compassion training. I asked Bob Thurman about that once, and he said there's no mention of the self in compassion training in a Buddhist. I mean, it's not focusing on the self at all. But I understand it's more of a therapeutic version of compassion. So what are you saying, Justin? What's different about your understanding and experience through your training?
In terms of compassion?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's amazing. First of all, it's great, and I'm really happy to see all of the research that's being done and the trainings that are being offered by Stanford CCARE and programs at Emory and so forth. Really adapting the Tibetan discourse of compassion to a secular context, and obviously, whatever we might think about the agendas of science, it does work, and it is healthy in some metric. It does help people,
right?
And that's great. And so I just want to make that clear, and that's again, it's a starting point. So now, beyond that, though, if we stop there and just think about how compassion and becoming more compassionate can help us to be happy and healthier, and to create better relationships and so forth. Even though that's a good thing, it's first of all, it's not the way that the tradition itself presents that training. And secondly, if we do stop there, it can very easily be co-opted, yet again, just like everything else in mindfulness, by materialist interests. You can make money off of it in various ways that exploit people's good nature, and so those are two issues. And so the first part is that when the tradition discusses compassion, it's always presented in tandem with emptiness, with the insight of selflessness and interdependence of phenomena, and to really understand and to have a actual valid, authentic metaphysical ground for how emptiness and compassion interpenetrate one another. It really does have to be a training in emptiness, in groundlessness, and someone who is approaching compassion practice has to also approach the experiential, the embodied, somatic, total being experience of losing ground, of completely losing any reference points for anything whatsoever, and especially the person who is compassionate and the object of compassion and the act and so forth. Because if you don't, it just becomes another game of the ego. And to the extent that is true, the compassion is limited and the effect is diminished. So really, how do we connect with and cultivate non-referential, completely boundless, completely unlimited compassion? And then to do that, we need to cultivate insight. And then automatically, this would short circuit any kind of co-opting by any materialist interests.
Yes, and one of the other things I think you bring up is if you look at the instructions, let's say, for mindfulness training, to be in the present moment, non-judgmentally. In a way, it has similarities to some of the same instructions you would get from pointing out instructions, but they're very, very different in terms of the training that would happen prior to be given these higher order teachings in the Tibetan tradition. Yet, I think there's a lot of linguistic conflation going on between the instructions that you might get in an 8-week course as being equivalent to the teachings on emptiness. Can you say something about that? Isn't that more of a capstone training in the Tibetan traditions?
Yeah. So there's, this is another issue. I think it's fine. First of all, I think it's, on one level it may seem disingenuous, but just that the language is getting out there and being related to by people, even if it's in a mindfulness training. I think it's really good, and I think that the place that it was inspired by, I think John Kabat-Zinn particularly in the way that he has come from the Zen tradition and now just in general, it's just everybody's all mixed together, and so we sort of the non-dual traditions and the Theravadan traditions, Zen traditions, everybody is sort of using similar language, and so when that translates into mindfulness context, it's just natural, and I think it's fine as a starting point, but in order for that to really mature, and for practitioners to not just stop at those initial instructions and the experiences that they elicit, there needs to be additional support. And again, like I said before, that traditionally that would come in both the context, a thorough training in which those instructions are the capstone, and also in the context of a personal relationship with a realized master. And so we don't have either of those in the mindfulness context, really. I mean, we can approximate it, but there's no contextualizing framework of a tradition surrounding it. There's very little support for a graduated path that sets the stage for those instructions to really hit home. And there's a really marked paucity of teachers who are on that level that can authentically point out and give those instructions so that they are recognized to be as profound as they can be. So, yeah.
No, go ahead. I just have a question.
That's all. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I mean, how can you envision a secular context of that? In other words, groundlessness comes from a Tibetan Buddhist or Buddhist point of view, and I agree with you. I think that secular mindfulness MBIs stop at a certain point, and I think I'd love to see a North American culture in which we do follow up on what you're saying. I'd love to know how we can create that within our culture without sort of going to a specific Buddhist tradition. I mean, Ron and I have noted people who they smuggle in Buddhism. It's kind of, that's one of the issues. Well, we're really Buddhist, but we're starting with this, and I mean, how do we, where do we go from here? I guess is one question.
Yeah, and I think that's really the question, the main question for a lot of us, and there's no answer. It is the ongoing experiment, and I think that part of the answer is ongoing critical attention on both sides, and always keeping the mind keeping a watch on how things can be distorted, while at the same time having the courage to make mistakes and the courage to innovate and develop and move out of the strictures of the tradition in ways that might be frowned upon by some people. And so, between those two, a dedication and allegiance to a critical viewpoint, and at the same time a courage to innovate and develop, I think that it's already happening.
Okay. On the critical side, I mean, one of my concerns with John Kabat-Zinn and other people in that tradition is they basically ride over the fact that what Ron said earlier is that I think what you're describing is a higher order kind of practice. And so there are people that I read that say, well, just by practicing mindfulness, people are going to have skillful compassion. They're going to know what to do. They're going to know how to do it, and that's, to me, that's very problematic. They're skipping over. It's kind of a spiritual bypass, which you mentioned in your chapter. That's one concern I have. The other, contextual issues are we still have to look at people's individual development, which you mentioned in your chapter that people are, we still have to kind of develop an ego for to function in the world and to see the connection between an ego and a kind of a higher order consciousness. And the other issue that you don't really touch upon that we may not be able to get into here is some of this leads to trauma. I know that Ron mentioned Willoughby Britton, who's done research on trauma, and that has to be addressed in any kind of as like you said, as we move forward and with our experimenting and to acknowledge that as well.
Yeah, and again, I think the fundamental answer to all of this is that we need to have to cultivate the depth of experience and methods of facilitators who themselves have been through the trials and have been able to make use of a diversity of methods, traditional, modern, psychological, everything on the horizon that can really be brought to bear in the training and facilitation of students. And so I think a lot of the burden needs to also rest on the genuine practice and experience of facilitators and teachers.
Yeah, one of the things that I pick up on in your writings is just how much I would say care that you really are on the one hand pushing the envelope, but at the same time you seem to be extremely careful about the distortions and the risk that might be an unintended consequence of these kinds of innovations. I'm curious, since you had a lot of contact with Tibetan teachers, did they? What is their view about? Have they discussed with you taking Tibetan forms and innovating and trying to make them more accessible in a secular context? Have they encouraged you, or I'm just curious?
Yeah, highly discouraged in general. Two of my main teachers, not personally, I've never been personally discouraged, but just, and I think a lot of times it's a corrective. They know what I'm doing, and they make comments about the field in general, and sort of caution about the uselessness of it and so forth. And I think that generally in the circles that I've been trained in, which are basically fundamentalist circles, which is what I was attracted to most. That it was very frowned upon. But then I think in terms of my more Western teachers, especially Lama Deni in France, developed a whole cycle of mindfulness training inspired by Dzogchen Mahamudra approach, which is extremely innovative. And I found a lot of collaborative inspiration from him, because he holds the tradition and at the same time is willing to adapt and create in order to meet the needs of students, and also to trust the maturity of people that they can actually move into these other deeper domains. And I also see that with another of my teachers, Mingyur Rinpoche, who has a whole secular program called The Joy of Living, in which he, regardless of what he says and other people say, he is teaching the nature of mind, and gives people a lot of space and trust to explore that. So it's all mixed up, and I see it all being part of the overall dialectic of of conservatism and innovation.
Right. Why don't you say a little bit about you're leading a retreat later in the summer? Are you?
Yeah, a few. Yeah. Which one do you mean?
Something about the Earth Vase Pilgrimage.
Sure. Yeah. So that was an offshoot of the Stupa project, because we're in the Bible Belt, and not many people down there know what a stupa is, let alone appreciate the benefits. And so, part of what we came up with is to create an understanding of how does giving back to the earth and work, and how does that actually enrich people's experience without so much of the Tibetan and traditional overlay. And so the idea that I and some other people came up with was to develop a pilgrimage program in the Smoky Mountains, particularly along the Appalachian Trail, in which we bury treasure vases, which are like jewels or gifts to the earth. And they contain mandala and all sorts of blessed substances and so forth. But really, it's a ritual of traveling through space, through different natural environments, and finding places that resonate, with the group that is the pilgrimage group, and then creating shrines and burying these vases, so that in the future they can become nexus points for pilgrimage. And in Asia and all throughout Europe, the landscape is dotted with shrines and places for honoring the sacred. And in our culture and our land, that has been completely erased on many levels. And so it's an effort to rekindle a relationship with the sacredness of the land, and also to nurture a type of intuition of reciprocity that will connect with the Stupa project in general.
In terms of that project, are you explicitly working with local Christian groups, given that you mentioned you're in the Bible Belt? At times I do. With that particular project, it's open to anyone, but nothing explicit. No. Did you read or think about Paul Tillich? Because in your chapter you mentioned matters of ultimate concern, which always strikes me as one of his terms. And he also, this is a whole other discussion in terms of the dialectic between the more Western Christian culture and Tibetan Buddhism. But he talks about the ground of being explicitly, and then we're talking more about groundlessness. And that's a whole interesting dialectic. Are they ultimately two sides of the same coin, or is it just a matter of language?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because Justin, you do almost like paradoxically talk about groundlessness as being actually our saving grace, to be grounded in the earth.
Yeah. Right. And especially when it should never be relegated to a conceptual sort of experience. It's profoundly somatic. Groundlessness is a full-bodied experience of the release of any kind of fixation and grasping, which is inherently blissful and is inherently spacious. And when groundlessness is when we touch groundlessness in the body, it immediately connects us with this notion of the earth as well. And when there is a release of fixation on that level, then the earth is also sacred. Our body is sacred. The earth is sacred. And so it is the ground. When release of fixation of any kind of this kind of limitation and boundary is groundlessness. But then paradoxically, that release is the ground for ethical action, is the ground for connection and communication between people and so forth.
That's beautiful. Well, maybe we'll end on this beautiful note of groundlessness. And thank you so much, Justin, for joining us on the Mindful Cranks.
Thank you. Yeah.
and we will be in touch.
Okay, thanks a lot.
We have been listening to Justin Wall, Lama Karma, who has over 7 years of teaching experience, both as a facilitator of mindfulness training through Clear Light Mindfulness and in more traditional context. He graduated with honors from Columbia University with degrees in English literature and religious studies, and completed 2 3-year retreats and 1 6-month retreat in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. He completed a year-long certification course in mindfulness facilitation through the Mindfulness Awareness Research Center at UCLA. Justin Wall is the spiritual director of the Milarepa Retreat Center in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, and founded the Earth Vase Pilgrimage project in the Smoky and Blue Ridge region. Thank you for listening to the Mindful Cranks. Please be sure to check out our website, mindfulcranks.com, and subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. If you feel so inclined, we would appreciate writing a brief review of our podcast on iTunes. Also, check out our Facebook and Twitter pages.